Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Afghanistan, the country famously known as the graveyard of empires, or the country equivalent of stepping on a Lego in the dark. Since the US packed up its military and left town, the Taliban have moved back in. And just like any other governing power, they have done their fair share of diplomacy despite a relative persona non grata status across the world. Because unlike much of what we call the West, which is geographically removed from the region, Central Asia has simply shrugged and said, well, guess we're doing business again. So that's what we're looking at today. What are the Central Asian countries' relation with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan? Well, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Afghanistan is teetering on the edge of fully becoming one of the world's pariah states. Ever since the Taliban retook control over the country, its geopolitical situation has been controversial, to say the least. Outside of the classic trifecta of world powers, the US, China and Russia, a very important interested party is Central Asia. Despite being so close to them geographically, Afghanistan is not considered part of this community of nations. Central Asian states have made some recent overtures towards Kabul. While not eager to establish political ties, they are interested in exploring cooperation in areas such as trade, transportation, and perhaps most importantly, food, due to the current humanitarian situation in the country. They are adopting a very pragmatic approach towards the Taliban, who so far have not garnered much international goodwill.
The de facto authorities have so far treated the Afghan state's international obligations selectively, rejecting some on the basis they allegedly impinge on the country's sovereignty.
Russia is another country which has shown interest in, at the very least, flirting with improving relations with Afghanistan. A recent meeting between Taliban and Russian authorities, and Russia delisting Taliban as a terrorist organization, points to Moscow adopting a similarly pragmatic approach. In terms of future relations with the West, however, the situation will be much more difficult to overcome.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Since their return to power in 2021, the Taliban have firmly solidified themselves as Afghanistan's government. And despite several dire economic and environmental challenges, the regime is not at risk of collapsing. Here's more about what the last few years of Taliban rule have looked like.
August 2021, the Taliban returned to power and Afghanistan's region holds its breath. After years of struggle and American presence, the country's political situation experiences a seismic shift. Years on, much has changed for the country. Many would say not for the better. During their recent reign, the Taliban have rolled back many rights that women enjoyed under the American-supported government. Today, women and girls have lost access to education, employment, and even public spaces in Afghanistan. Although these policies have been met with stern condemnation from the international community, not much can actually be physically done to help them. The country has also seen a series of natural disasters, which have led to high death tolls, famine, and put its import-based economy under heavy strain. In ordinary circumstances, such a dire situation would be met with hefty amounts of foreign aid. Yet Afghanistan is a sanctioned country over the regime's violations of human rights and terrorism charges. The new US administration has also cut almost all aid to the country, meaning that reconstruction efforts are either slow or non-existent. While the Taliban boast of a return to tradition and independence, the country could not be in more dire straits.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Uzbekistan was the first out of the gate, promptly recognizing the Taliban regime. Kazakhstan followed suit, officially accepting the Taliban's diplomatic credentials. Now, Turkmenistan, staying true to its vibe as Central Asia Switzerland, is keeping neutral. And then we have Tajikistan, the neighborhood skeptic who views Afghanistan about as trustingly as you'd view a gas station sushi roll. Now, despite this, electricity from Tajikistan keep flowing into Afghanistan because apparently ideology is negotiable, but monthly power bills are sacred. Kyrgyzstan, meanwhile, is busy navigating its own drama involving ethnic Kyrgyz trapped in Afghanistan's remote Pamir region. Still, they took the Taliban off their terror list because, at the end of the day, economic pragmatism does beat morality. Every single time. But here's where it gets interesting. The Taliban are digging the Kosh-Tepa Canal, planning to divert around 25% of the water from Amudara River, a major water source from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Now, these neighbors, faced with losing significant water resources, decided cooperation was preferable to a drought-induced apocalypse. Surprisingly, fears of regional instability following the American withdrawal haven't fully materialized. Maybe everyone was so exhausted by the chaos that they collectively decided, let's just calm down and try adulting for once. However, the United States, despite stepping back militarily, remains influential. They still got embassies and investments across Central Asia, proving that just because the party is over doesn't mean Uncle Sam isn't somewhere close. Ultimately, Central Asia's pragmatic approach to Afghanistan is less about endorsing the Taliban and more about accepting the reality that stability trumps ideology and access to water trumps everything else. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Bennier, a board member of the Caspian Policy Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So today we're trying to explore Central Asia's kind of attitude towards the Taliban. We see some movements there, and they seem to be establishing some sort of diplomatic tie. Traditionally, when we hear about working with the Taliban in the West, we kind of have a little bit of a kind of feeling to it. But how are the Central Asians dealing with them? What's the general attitude?
Well, I think behind closed doors, the Central Asians have a similar attitude to the West. This is not their neighbor of choice. There's no doubt about it. That said, it is their neighbor. And they've done a much better job this time, I suppose better is a fair word, of dealing with the Taliban than they did when the Taliban were in power in the late 1990s. So they've engaged with them constructively. They've kept the relationship on a business level. For the most part, and that seems to have helped them. Obviously, there's very different forms of government. The Central Asians are secular. The Taliban are actually exactly what the Central Asians fear as a government. They a government that rules based on Islam, because of course most of Central Asia's people are Muslims. So it's a competing vision of how you can run your country that the Central Asians don't appreciate very much. But as I said, they've done a much different job of dealing with the Taliban this time around, and they do have a constructive relationship.
Right. Whenever we talk about Central Asia, we do see a lot of kind of pragmatic decisions being made. Do you think it has much to do with being sandwiched between all these troublesome neighbors, be it China, Russia, and now even the Taliban in Afghanistan?
It's partly that. I think, you got to give some credit to what happened during the 20 years when the Taliban were out of power, when the U.S.-led operation was going on in Afghanistan. Part of that had to do with connecting Central Asia to Afghanistan. I mean, the hope was that trade between Central Asia and maybe further afield, China, Russia, would boom. And to some extent, it really has. But during those 20 years, they really laid the infrastructure foundations for this to happen. There was a single railway that connected Afghanistan to Central Asia. It went through Uzbekistan. It only went 12 kilometers deep into Afghanistan and then ended. They extended that from the border of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan all the way to Mazar-e-Sharif, which is the biggest city in northern Afghanistan. So it's a much better connection. There's a couple other railways that now lead into Afghanistan from Turkmenistan. They're talking about expanding and developing railway connections even further. There's a lot of roads that connect Afghanistan and Central Asia. And I think one of the big things that changed was that Central Asia is exporting electricity to Afghanistan through power lines that were all built during those 20 years. Central Asian countries account for about 80% of Afghanistan's imported electricity. Now, it's a way for all the Central Asian countries that border Afghanistan, and that's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, to make money. And it's something that the Taliban really need. So you can see where this is, as you described it, a pragmatic relationship. I mean, there's something to be gained from interacting with each other and not being hostile to each other as they were in the late 1990s.
And how would you characterize their cooperation level? Is it better than the previous regime, or do you see perhaps a little bit of tense in the relation there?
It's far better. Again, like I said, they've tried to keep it to the greatest extent possible on a business relationship. Again, the two forms of government are the form of government in Central Asian states and then the one in Afghanistan are absolutely opposite of each other. That said, there's another element that the Central Asians are particularly interested in, is that is the Taliban's promise that Afghanistan will never be used by any group to plot or carry out attacks on its neighbors. So there's members of militant groups in Afghanistan, some that are allied with the Taliban, some that are opposing the Taliban. I'm thinking of Islamic State of Khorasan province specifically at the moment, but they have Central Asian citizens in their ranks. So the fact that the Afghan government, current Afghan government, the Taliban are promising that they won't let these groups use Afghan territory to carry out an attack on Central Asia means a lot to the Central Asians, because in the 1990s, they did have a problem with a domestic terrorist group called the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which did enjoy safe haven in Afghanistan and was able to recoup and rearm itself and then come back in the summers of 1999 and 2000 and attack southern Kyrgyzstan, parts of eastern Uzbekistan. So the Taliban have gone out of their way to not only reassure but show that they are trying to keep these groups in check, so they present no threat whatsoever to their neighbors. And that means a lot for Central Asia.
And do you think that this increased level of cooperation with the Taliban would actually sour Central Asia's relation with the West?
It's a delicate balancing act. There's no doubt about it. I think most Western countries appreciate the fact that there's a proximity issue here. The Central Asians can't ignore the Taliban, and as I mentioned, in the 1990s, with the exception of Turkmenistan, they took a very hostile stance toward the Taliban, which made things very uneasy along the border. It cost the Central Asian governments that border Afghanistan money to reinforce their borders, send extra troops down there. Their threats were passed back and forth over the border during the 5 years the Taliban were in. So it was a very tense situation for all those years. The West understands that the Central Asian governments don't need this problem. I mean, they would rather devote their time and energy to domestic affairs and foreign policies away from Afghanistan with other countries. The Central Asians are certainly fortunate that they do have Chinese backing for this, and China has a pretty good relationship with the Taliban. They do have Russian backing, and Russia has a pretty good relationship with the Taliban. So while the West might be a little uneasy about it, certainly it's something that's very easy to understand why the Central Asians are taking the positions that they are. I think the West appreciates the fact that the Central Asians are trying to develop trade routes that go through Afghanistan, but ultimately benefit other parties. So they're looking for routes that would get them to the Middle East. They're looking for routes that get them to Pakistan and on to India, Eastern Africa. So these are routes that the West can't take advantage of immediately, but sometime 10, 20 years down the road, it might actually be beneficial to Western countries, specifically Europe.
And like you said, China, Russia, and these regional powers, and now Central Asia is increasingly friendly towards the Taliban. Do you think that pretty much cements its legitimacy in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think you'd have to say that at this point. Russia's taken them off the list of terrorist groups. China, of course, has not only been interacting with the Taliban, but investing. Their stream of investment was practically uninterrupted when there was the change of government in August 2021. It looks like even the Central Asian governments have kind of slowly and perhaps grudgingly followed like Russia's lead, where they're taking them off the terrorist list. They're talking about possible recognition sometime in the future. It hinges really, in the case of the Central Asians, it hinges on an inclusive government, one that includes all the ethnic groups or the major ethnic groups in Afghanistan into the Afghan government. That's understandable. There's a large Uzbek population. There's a large Tajik population. There's a significant Turkmen population in Afghanistan. So, the governments in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan would obviously like to see their cultural kin across the border play a role in Afghanistan, with the role of facilitating relations between Afghanistan and Central Asia.
Right, and like you mentioned earlier, a lot of these decisions were also made out of pragmatism, out of necessity. But if you were to ask like a typical person in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, for example, what's their view on the Taliban, do you think that the general population within Central Asia have a positive view towards the current Afghan government?
Wow, this is a really interesting and complicated question to answer. I think this is going to vary a lot. A lot of the Central Asian citizens, certainly in some countries more than others, understand that their governments are generally kind of repressive. They are secular governments, even though all these governments in Central Asia acknowledge the fact that they are a majority Muslim population. They go out of their way to to assure the people that they're free to practice their religion as long as they don't oppose the government. At the same time, a country like Tajikistan, for instance, is poverty-stricken. It's the poorest country of the Central Asian countries. It's got essentially an authoritarian government running it. It's a family-run operation. The president's in power now. His son is the second most powerful person in the country. Everyone knows he's going to take over. Now, if you ask some people in Tajikistan, which of these governments is better, the family rule in Tajikistan or the Taliban based on their idea of Sharia, you might find people, fair number of people in Tajikistan and some in the other Central Asian countries too, that would say the Taliban have a better idea of how to run the government. It's not cronyism, at least to the extent that it's present in Central Asia. It's more based on the idea of justice and fairness, according to Islamic teachings, even though it's specifically the Taliban's teachings. So, this is another reason why the Central Asian governments, as I mentioned at the start, they're kind of uneasy about the fact that the Taliban are in. It's easy to compete against another secular government and say that they're better off under the current administration's authorities in Central Asia. But the fear of the Central Asian governments has always been that Islam will be used as a unifying force to overthrow the current governments in Central Asia. And if we look at some of the people that are in power in Central Asia, they don't really know very much about Islam, whereas their people know a lot about it. I mean, they've used the last 34 years of independence to really bring themselves up and educate themselves about what the religion's all about. Whereas a lot of the leadership and all, I don't want to pick on the Tajik president again and again, but he's in his 70s. He came out of the Soviet Union, and pretty much all the leaders of the Central Asian countries, with the exception of possibly Turkmenistan, but almost all the leadership the current leaders spent the first half of their life in the Soviet Union. So they didn't have access to the religion. So it's something they have to worry about all the time. The Taliban are all about Islam. They say they're all about Islam. The people in the Central Asian countries are becoming more Islamic all the time, and they see the injustice that's present in their own countries. Would they use the Taliban model or something similar to that to unify resistance to the current governments in Central Asia? It's a concern that the Central Asian governments have. They've had it for all these years, remembering that, of course, in the early 90s, when they became independent, Iran was considered the fundamentalist government you had to worry about. So it is a concern. There probably is some sympathy for at least a Taliban style of government in Central Asia, but so far the Central Asian governments have been able to keep a lid on that.
Right, certainly a very interesting viewpoint looking at it from this perspective. Thank you so much for bringing us your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Great. Thanks for inviting me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The negotiations surrounding a possible peace in Ukraine may soon see a breakthrough. U.S. President Donald Trump says he is optimistic that both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky will attend the upcoming talks in Istanbul.
The summit in Istanbul is an idea put forward by Moscow. The Kremlin called for such a meeting after Ukraine and its European partners pushed for a 30-day ceasefire. Turkey has been willing to host a meeting between the two countries for a couple of years now, as it has offered to act as a mediator in the conflict multiple times, partially because of its influence in the Black Sea region. The United States responded positively to the idea, and the US president has been putting pressure on both the Russian and Ukrainian leaders to attend in person. Donald Trump has also suggested that he could be part of the talks. Zelensky has already said that he is ready to meet with Putin in Turkey. Should the two leaders meet, it would be the first time they will have done so since prior to the start of the invasion in 2022.
Thank you. Vladimir Putin seems eager to continue his recent diplomatic offensive. Iran is apparently preparing for a visit by the Russian president.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow and Tehran have become closer than ever before. So much so, in fact, that Vladimir Putin's very first foreign trip after the war's outbreak outside of former Soviet states was to meet with Iran's supreme leader. Following that meeting, the two countries began working together in various fields, including military aid. Iran has been supplying Russia with large amounts of military equipment, such as Shahed drones. This cooperation culminated in a strategic partnership that was signed earlier this year. Unlike in the case of some of the other similar partnerships that Moscow has recently signed, this pact with Iran did not include a mutual defense clause.
Russia is looking to tighten control over Georgia's breakaway Abkhazia region. For the first time in 32 years, a direct flight from Moscow landed in the region's capital of Sukhumi.
Abkhazia is internationally recognized as part of Georgia, though such distinctions have rarely stopped Russia from interfering with the local affairs of such regions, and this one in particular has been supported by the Kremlin since the 1990s. Alongside the recent passenger flight, Russia has also launched a railway line to the region. Although this may seem innocuous at first glance, the symbolic meaning of these connections has far-reaching consequences. Russia's control over the region is soft but can become harsh in a matter of moments. In response to 2024 protests against policy helping Russians scoop up property in the region, Moscow halted various aid and supply deliveries, forcing multiple blackouts until its desired political outcome was achieved. The revival of travel connections to Abkhazia may mean that Russia is looking to bring the area back into the fold, especially given that the ruling Georgian Dream has been accused of pro-Russian sympathies.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.